For 2 decades now, I have been a full-time commentator, writing in the papers, arguing on radio and television, trying to change people's minds. It's been a challenge. And not just because I've been sued and abused and targeted by the ABC, threatened by terrorists and even attacked in the street. No. What's hardest has been this. Most people actually hold opinions that they haven't reached through reason at all. Most won't change those opinions through reason either. You can argue with facts and logic until you're black in the face. Reason won't work. Give you an easy example. Why do Christians usually have Christian parents? Muslims usually Muslim parents. Jews mostly Jewish parents. Why? Because even their most fundamental beliefs come not from reason and intellectual inquiry and looking around and choosing. They come from an accident of birth. They were born into them. Now, that's one example, and in a second I'll raise some more with Mark Lynas. Now, Lynas, a very smart bloke, articulate. Yet for years he fought against genetically modified crops and nuclear power when he now admits the science was against him. Now, how did that happen? And it's not alone, of course. Why does Lynas now fight for another big green scare, global warming? And with such tribal anger that he pushed a pie into the face of Professor Bjørn Lomborg, a very mild-mannered statistician who had simply pointed out a truth that most global warming policies don't work. They don't cut the temperature by anything you could measure. He's right. But Lomborg's facts count for so little that 2 Australian universities even banned his world-famous Copenhagen Consensus Center from their campuses, even when they were offered a grant to host it. And student leaders at those campuses, so invincibly ignorant on the facts and the arguments that Lomborg has studied for years, but that didn't matter. They didn't care. They simply claimed that Lomborg was too evil to teach them.
There were significant issues around the reputational damage that people thought would come from being a university that would take in Bjørn Lomborg.
Yeah, that is the voice of a generation that prefers to seem good to actually being wise. As I said, invincibly ignorant. And politicians pandered to this. Labor leader Bill Shorten today, great example. Now, Shorten, of course, is infamous for this response to a question about health policy back when Julia Gillard was Prime Minister and his boss.
I understand that the Prime Minister's addressed this in a press conference in Turkey in the last few hours. I haven't seen what she said, but let me say I support what it is that she said.
Shorten today actually gave much the same answer to questions about yesterday's report by the ACCC on our sky-high electricity prices. Now, it doesn't seem to matter that this corporate watchdog proved that green energy policies are hurting us, hurting you. Doesn't matter that it also showed why governments should now subsidise cheaper and more reliable new power stations. Coal, really. Whatever it said, Shorten was against it without having read it.
So what we've got is we've got a debate which is about placating the knuckle-draggers of the cave-dwelling right of the Liberal Party, promising mirage coal-fired power stations which cost billions of dollars, all because Mr Turnbull hasn't got the intestinal fortitude to back in renewable energy as part of the energy mix.
Have you read the report?
Oh, I haven't yet read the report.
But look, really, I've got to forgive the bloke. I mean, because really, isn't that how all of us at times reach our opinions? I mean, we go with the flow. We choose what's easy, we choose what's convenient, we choose what our mates believe, we repeat what will get us a good mark, a vote or a round of applause, no matter how bat-crazy or wrong.
But coal is more expensive. Coal is getting more expensive than renewables all the time.
No, Tanya, that's absolutely false. Coal is our cheapest baseload power. But who cares? Give you another example. Every Prime Minister must know our global warming policies make no difference to the climate, none. But they never admit it. Even the Prime Minister who once claimed that global warming was the greatest moral challenge of our time could not give me a straight answer to a straight question I keep asking. An IPCC author, Professor Roger Jones, we're talking science, says your carbon policies will at best cut the world's temperature by 4/1000ths of 1 degree by the end of the century. 4/1000ths. Do you seriously think it's worth us spending all this money, these taxes, these programs, to do essentially nothing about the temperature?
The International Panel of Climate Change Scientists that you just referred to contains within it 4,000 scientists. You've just chosen to quote one.
In fact, not one of Rudd's 4,000 scientists has ever given a better figure. None. Okay? He wouldn't give you a straight answer because he knows you would hate what it is. It's all for nothing. No, people tend to believe what they want to believe. And that's why they get so angry when you show that the facts are against them. That threatens them. And so they respond with, well, not with facts because they haven't got it. They respond with abuse and they respond with threats and they respond with bans and even violence. Still, we must do what we can, mustn't we? Fight for reason and, these days, for simply the right to put our case and hope that truth wins in the end. Speaking of which, Mark Lynas. Now, as I said, smart bloke. Also one of the world's top global warming activists. He was indeed even once the leader of the campaign in Britain against genetically modified crops. Now, those are food crops that scientists have genetically engineered to make them healthier for us or more resistant to droughts or particularly pests and diseases so that farmers don't have to use as much chemicals. But Lynas used to even destroy test plantings of GM crops, claiming that they're somehow poisonous. And in Australia, Greenpeace activists have destroyed test wheat crops that were genetically engineered by the CSIRO to improve our bowel health. And this ridiculous scare continues. I mean, GM crops are banned even today in Tasmania and, wouldn't you guess, South Australia. But 5 years ago, give him a big tick, Mark Lynas admitted he was wrong in a speech that went viral.
For the record, here and up front, I want to apologise for having spent several years ripping up GM crops. I'm also sorry that I helped start the anti-GM movement back in the 90s and that I thereby assisted in demonising an important technological option which can and should be used to benefit the environment. As an environmentalist and someone who believes that everyone in this world has a right to a healthy and nutritious diet of their choosing, I could not have chosen a more counterproductive path, and I now regret it completely.
Lynas is now in Australia to promote his new book, Seeds of Science, it's called. Seeds of Science, Why We Got It So Wrong on GMOs. I spoke to him earlier today, but not just about his activism on GM food, also about his past scaremongering on global warming. Mark Lynas, thank you so much indeed for your time. Can you explain to me what made you and other green activists initially think that genetically modified crops were bad? Or maybe the question is, why did you want to think they were bad?
Well, if you wind the clock back to 1996, which was when I first started campaigning against GM crops, it looked like this was a really, dangerous direction for farming to move in. These were seeds produced by Monsanto in order to allow farmers to spray Roundup on their fields, and Monsanto was selling both products. And so, to me, this looked like it was going to be using more chemicals, and it was going to be pushing farming in a less sustainable direction. Plus, it was employing these kind of frankenfoods. It was using crossing genes across the species barrier, and that was something that, as environmentalists, we were extremely concerned about.
But in your book, you made clear that at that stage you hadn't actually checked the science much, and I really ask again, why you and the activist movement generally wanted to believe this was the case?
I think we were against it sort of irrespective of the science, and these was early days. I mean, the science wasn't in the way that it is now, 20 years later. But I think it was this idea of transgenics. You know, you've probably heard of all of these stories about fish genes in tomatoes or whatever it happens to be. That case happens to be mythological, but with GMOs generally, what scientists are doing is taking genes from one species and putting it into another. And I think we had this kind of intuitive revulsion of that whole process. It seemed to be taking technology too far, and we thought that it was almost bound to have environmental or health negative consequences.
Right, so you had this intuitive revulsion. What made you change your mind?
Well, I had to change my mind ultimately because the science did come in and the science was highly persuasive. Plus, I was somebody who wanted to take science seriously and wanted to be seen to take science seriously because I'd been writing books about climate change by that time. So I'd written two big books on global warming. I spent a lot of time arguing with skeptics about whether global warming was real, human caused, that kind of stuff. And I would always say to them, listen, you've got to take the science seriously. There's a scientific consensus. Now you've probably heard the figure that 97% of the peer-reviewed papers out there support the man-made global warming hypothesis. And the problem I had was that to be consistent scientifically, there's a similar level of consensus that GMOs are safe and have been useful to farmers and the environment. So I couldn't go out there and say you must listen to the scientists on climate change, but you must ignore the scientists on GMOs. So I wanted to, ultimately I had to make a decision, and I decided I needed to be pro-science across both those areas.
On that 97% figure, I think that figure has actually been debunked. I've got a couple of friends whose papers are included in that survey, and they say they do not agree with catastrophic man-made warming theory, but that wasn't exactly what was measured. But let's have that argument for perhaps later.
Yeah, we can have a whole discussion on that one, but yeah.
That's right. Can you tell me, with genetically modified crops, what good can they do? What is it that makes you think they should be supported?
Well, genetically modified crops aren't actually that special or that different from anything that's come before. Basically, what scientists are doing is breeding new traits into crops which are useful to farmers or potentially useful to consumers as well. So there's lots of different ways that's done. Some of the things that are happening at the moment is biofortification. So if you've heard about golden rice, this is rice which is bred to have vitamin A in it, which hopefully can help tackle vitamin A deficiency, which is a major malnutrition problem in many developing countries. So that's aimed at saving the lives of young children, and that's one way that genetic modification is being used. Another is insect resistance. So if you get a gene into a crop which protects against insect pests, then farmers no longer need to spray it with pesticides, and that's being done on a small scale in a eggplant in Bangladesh, for example. 30,000 farmers have drastically reduced their insecticide sprays because they've got BT brinjal, it's called in that language. So there's lots of different ways that genetic modification can and is being used, and most of them are positive and beneficial. And therefore, calls from the Greens to say we should ban this technology or we should continue moratorium like they've got in South Australia, that's not only is that anti-science in my view, it's also bad for the environment.
Look, it's extraordinary that South Australia and Tasmania too have both still got bans on GM crops. It's just incredible. It's anti-science. And to go through your book, the case for the potential case for these GM crops in terms of better yields and healthier crops is just I just think irrefutable. What makes you think they're still banned?
It's a national embarrassment, really, to have these bans, because I don't know. It's like banning witchcraft, or it's a really antiquated policy. I'm sure it was put there originally to appease the Greens or for some political reason, but that hopefully times have changed. But it does look anti-science. You're saying, look, the products of science are not, of modern science, are not applicable to Australian farming in these two states. Is there a good reason for that? Of course not, because what happens in reality is that where GMOs have allowed the reduction of pesticides, in these states you're going to continue having pesticides. So you've got this odd alliance between the pesticide manufacturers and the Greens, who are all saying, no, we don't want GMOs because they're going to cut down on crop spraying.
Now, Mark, I was shocked really by an interview that I heard last night on the ABC with you. You've been vilified, of course, for changing your mind, but I thought it was disgraceful of presenter Jeremy Fernandez last night to suggest that you were corrupt, that you'd been bought by GM companies, that you'd changed your mind for money. Can I just play you that unfounded smear so viewers can see what lengths some people will stoop to attack people like you? Here we go.
Do you wonder about your own credibility? Because not only have you changed your mind, you've also come out with a softer view of companies like Monsanto, which has its own troubled history when it comes to chemicals, PCBs, Agent Orange. And to some people, it sounds like you've been bought by big biotech. I don't know, those concerns have run through your head.
Mark, you haven't gone soft on Monsanto at all. Anyone reading your book can see that. But can you tell me, how vicious have the attacks on you been?
Well, look, I don't want to play the victim, and I wasn't too upset about the questions about Monsanto because I've heard it 1,000 times before. What happens is that, you know, your opponents try to attack your credibility, and because Monsanto's got a high name recognition factor, and it's often, you know, people think it's the most evil company in the world, if they can somehow align me with Monsanto, then they don't have to listen to my arguments and they can just dismiss the science, which is what tends to happen. So I have to sit there and say, no, I haven't taken any money from Monsanto, and I'm happy to be completely transparent about what support I'm getting. As I told the ABC show yesterday, my flight was paid for by the Sydney Opera House to come and speak there on Saturday. So thanks very much to them for that.
Have you ever asked yourself why you and others in the Green movement seem tempted to believe in apocalyptic green scares, nuclear power and GM crops that are going to poison the world and stalk like triffids over the landscape? Have you wondered why that is, the attraction of that kind of cause?
Yeah, I think it's an important cultural part of the environmental mindset, if you like. The idea that things are getting worse inevitably, that human hubris and technology is inevitably going to devastate the planet. And look, on the climate issue, I'm absolutely persuaded still, I haven't changed my mind one iota on that. I think the science is still very strong, that we are facing a potentially catastrophic future. That's why I support nuclear power, because we do need to remove fossil fuels from the grid. And, you know, so some of these things are real, some of them aren't. And that's why we need science, in order to distinguish between what's true and what's not true. And, you know, that's the story of the modern era, 300 years since the European Enlightenment. And so my point for the whole GMO debate, nuclear, climate and everything else, is if you throw science out of the window, then you're flying blind. You won't even be able to see what's wrong with the world, let alone have any idea how to fix it.
Well, Mark, you're correct that is the third of the three apocalyptic things you do campaign on and still hold true to. We'll finish up with a quick note on that one. You've written a best-selling book, 6 Degrees, Our Future on a Hotter Planet, in which you warned we face a global wipeout by the end of this century. Here's a clip of you in a film a decade ago about those predictions.
Less than a degree of warming is what we've so far experienced, and that is enough to transform Australia, which was already the driest continent on Earth, into a landmass which has lost so much of its water that they're currently experiencing the worst drought for 1,000 years. Warmings of 6 degrees over longer time periods have been associated with some of the most devastating mass extinctions which have ever taken place. So it's certainly fair to assume that if temperatures soar by 6 degrees within less than a century, that we're going to face nothing less than a global wipeout.
Mark, that was back in 2008. That drought promptly finished. It wasn't the worst in 1,000 years. We've had great rains. We've had our dams refill. We've set record crops, grain crops since. We've had fewer cyclones as well, and of course, satellite measures show we've had less warming than the climate models predicted globally, and in Australia about zero. Do you think you might once more have fallen for a green scare?
Well, I like the dramatic music on that clip as well. If the science points in that direction, I'll be very happy to go with the way that that the evidence is showing. I don't think that's the case. I mean, there are climate impacts which are happening earlier and more severely. So, you mustn't be selective in terms of how you present this. You could look at the Great Barrier Reef and the coral bleaching impacts that are happening there. And of course, you've got to look at this globally. I mean, the number of cyclones hasn't increased. You're quite right about that, but the severity of them has. We've certainly seen sea level rise.
Not in Australia.
No, but you've got to look at this globally because cyclones are a global phenomenon across the tropics. So this is the thing about global warming, is that you can look at one place and you can say, well, actually somebody emailed me after the ABC thing yesterday, a meteorologist, saying, look, the temperature hasn't risen in this part of Melbourne, I think it was. And, I think, well, we're talking global warming here. There's no single location at any single point in time which is going to debunk that. You've got to look at the average of the data over long periods of time. And what we're talking about, and what I was talking about in 6 degrees, was projections. And so absolutely those are uncertain because they're based on computer models. They're based on extrapolating what's happened in the past. Not everything is going to unfold exactly as was predicted. And I expect I will have got some things wrong in 6 degrees. In fact, in my next book project, I'm going to be updating it and seeing how the science has changed, because I think it's actually a fascinating question. But that's the great thing about science. You can keep changing. You can keep updating your information as evidence comes in. It's nothing to be scared of. The point is not to be ideological about this.
No, but just lastly, you did say there you shouldn't be looking at one place because it's global warming. Correct. I dispute the thing about cyclones having got more severe. The evidence is mixed on that. But you did do that. You did actually go to one place. You went to Australia and said, here we have a 1 in 1,000 year drought. In 2008, we've run short of water and it's terrible. It's transforming the landscape. None of that actually has happened. We actually have quite normal rain and we have had record crops. Would you concede that perhaps you did beat up what happened in Australia in 2008?
Oh, maybe. I mean, I'll have to go and look at that. I mean, there was a 500-year drought in California at the time as well, and that kind of program that you showed the clip from, I mean, it does come across as as quite hyped. You can tell that with the dramatic music and the voiceover and all of that kind of style. So
but they were your words.
I'm a bit. Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly that's how things looked at the time, and I think you should be cautious about being dismissive of this. You have to plan for the long term. Clearly, Australia does face long-term challenges with water supply. And you have to plan for that, and climate change is going to increasingly be a factor. So if you sort of flip into denial about that, I don't think you'll be doing yourself or the future of this country any service, to be honest. Then
again, I think basing wild scares on a perfectly natural drought and claiming that well, you didn't, but Professor Tim Flannery did, that our dams would drain dry and we'd face a permanent drought, as the CSIRO Bureau of Meteorology claimed. That's also not acceptable either in a serious debate about this issue. But Mark, I appreciate the fact that on a number of issues you have been prepared to change your mind. I commend your book, and thank you so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
After the break, the politician smeared as a sleaze by Queensland's Deputy Premier for promoting World Bikini Day at its electorate's beaches. He responds, and so will the panel after this.